Roman army, which was partly the point of Alaric wanting the command in the first place. He had been angling for the command for two main reasons. First, it meant that his people were now hooked into the official imperial supply lines, so rather than having to go through the rigmarole of plundering, the Goths could now kick back and wait for regular shipments of food and supplies. Second, it meant that Alaric would now have access to the inner circle of Roman military planning and execution, and as long as he was in the room, nothing like the exploitation of the Goths that had happened at the Frigidus River would ever happen again. Alaric standing with his own people was at an all-time high, and though he was now technically subject to Arcadius, and by extension Eutropius, in practice, he was subject to no one at all. As great as this all was for Alaric, however, the deal wound up sowing the seeds of Eutropius' demise. There were more than a few people in the Empire who were not at all happy about the deal, especially the people who had just been terrorized by the Goths and who were now obligated to supply them in perpetuity. Maybe Eutropius could have weathered that political storm, but later in 398, he proceeded to make another key mistake that wound up pushing his career completely off the rails. A branch of the Huns had apparently gotten a little too friendly with the Roman front lines, and it became clear that they would have to be pushed back. But rather than assign one of his generals to see to that pushing back, Eutropius decided to take command for himself. Which, remember please, that Eutropius is a eunuch, with all the prejudicial baggage that status entails. Secretly running the empire as a high-ranking court official was one thing. That's the sort of thing you'd expect a eunuch to be up to. But leading troops in battle? Well, that was hugely offensive to conservative Roman sensibilities. The worst part of it, though, came later, when Eutropius' command proved to be entirely successful. Rather than take to the shadows like a eunuch should, Eutropius boldly stepped forward, took credit for the victim triumph. And then came the final affront. In January 399, Eutropius had himself named one of the consuls for the year. This was simply too much for most people to handle. Eunuchs were not consuls. Period. End of story. But Eutropius' hubris had gotten the better of him, and he simply assumed that he was untouchable. He was not. The exact sequence of events that wound up toppling Eutropius began in the spring of 399. Some Gothic auxiliaries who had been settled in Asia Minor began to complain that Eutropius had not delivered on promises made during the previous year's campaign against the Huns, and when they decided their complaints were falling on deaf ears, they picked up their swords to see if maybe Constantinople would listen to that. Eutropius did indeed listen, but instead of delivering on his promises, he sent some troops under the command of the Gothic general Gainas, who we met earlier at the assassination of Rufinus, to put down the Virgin Revolt. But Gainas, being ethnically Goth, sympathized with the leaders of the revolt, and did not try very hard to put them down. Instead, he opened up talks with them, not revolving on how to resettle them, but revolving around what was to be done with the eunuch. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, a backroom campaign to oust the arrogant Eutropius began to unfold, matching the talks that were going on out in the field. Spearheaded by a minister named Aurelian, the campaign eventually received the blessing and then the backing of the Empress Eudoxia, who had begun to feud with Eutropius now that he was getting too big for his britches. In mid-399, Eutropius opened up a dispatch from Gainas, and instead of reading about how the rabble had been defeated, he instead read about how the two sides had united in demanding Eutropius step down from office. This ultimatum was the cue for Aurelian's conspiracy to spring into action and destroy Eutropius' political credibility with the emperor, and with Eudoxia on board, they were able to quickly isolate the eunuch. Eutropius' 4 years in power were over, and he was either exiled or executed, depending on which source you believe. But the coalition to eliminate Eutropius turned on itself the minute it succeeded. Aurelian had been a convenient ally for Gainas as long as they shared the same enemy, but the minister was long suspected of having anti-army biases, and as soon as Eutropius was out of the picture, the Gothic general turned the leverage he held as the most powerful general in the East against his one-time ally, which is to say that Aurelian disappears from the historical record almost as suddenly as he appeared in the first place. As the 5th century dawned then, the Eastern Empire was essentially run by Eudoxia in the palace and Gainas out in the field. Arcadius, now 23 years old, was nowhere to be seen, as indifferent as he likely was incompetent. In the west, Stilicho continued to run the show for Honorius, who was no better than his older brother, and in the middle was Alaric and his Goths, now an officially sanctioned arm of the Eastern Roman army. Next week, Stilicho will continue to outlast his enemies in the east, as Gainas will fall almost as fast as he had risen. Stilicho will also continue his on-again, off-again wars with the Goths, who will pretty soon get it into their heads to invade Italy, but as had happened twice before, Alaric will once again escape Stilicho's clutches. And it was the rumors of barbarian collusion, as much as anything else, that will eventually see the Vandal general finally toppled from power. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 161, The Swamps of Ravenna. It wouldn't be fair to come down too hard on the successors of Theodosius for their failure to maintain even a semblance of cooperation between the eastern and western halves of the empire. After all, as two civil wars fully attested, it's not like Theodosius's reign had been a shiny beacon of collegiality. But still, as the year 400 dawned, it was clear that the leaders of the empire were simply not up to the task of maintaining imperial unity. In survey history books, the year 395 is often labeled as the year when the two halves of the empire became legally separate entities, when they split into being constitutionally independent political apparatuses. And though that is technically inaccurate, as a matter of understanding the transformations of late antiquity, I would say that, sure, that is more or less correct. From here on out, the East and West will act as rivals and enemies, at least as often as they act as friends and allies. Officially, of course, there never was a legal divorce, and right up until the bitter end, everyone paid lip service to a unified Rome. But unofficially, off the record, yeah, they've been living in separate houses for years. As the year 400 dawned, though, that unofficial-official separation was still in its infancy, and there really was a reasonable hope that the growing rift might be bridged. And so Stilicho, dominant statesman and general of the West, focused a huge amount of time and effort trying to build that bridge, the keystone being himself, naturally. But in the end, he wound up spending so much time and effort on the project that he neglected like half the provinces that it was his sworn duty to protect. And this neglect eventually had catastrophic consequences, not just for Stilicho's own life and career, but for the Western Empire as a whole. For the moment, however, Stilicho was about as strong politically as any non-emperor had ever been. He had successfully parried the dangerous thrusts of Alaric and his Goths, and then Gildo revolted and cut off the grain supply. Meanwhile, his rivals in the east had been having a hell of a time staying in power, as ministers and generals picked each other off one by one in a series of palace coups. For a brief moment in 400, the ethnically Goth general Gainas was ascendant, but after he returned to Constantinople with an army mostly composed of his own countrymen, he discovered that the citizens of the capital were not too psyched about these barbarians occupying their city. After a series of escalating incidents, in midsummer, Constantinople broke out into a full-scale riot, forcing Gainas to pull his men out of the city and flee, leaving behind some 7,000 Goths who were cornered by the mob and ripped to pieces. Over the course of these riots, the imperial palace itself was, if not totally burned to the ground, at least heavily damaged by fire. Gainas fled north to the Danube, and after crossing the river, he sought out the most powerful of the Hunnic kings, a man named Olden, and attempted to forge an alliance. But Olden, who was in the process of methodically consolidating his domination over the lands north of the Danube, took the opportunity to make a showing of friendly good faith to the Romans, and he sent Gainas' head in a gift-wrapped box back to Constantinople. With the East in a semi-sort of disarray, and the Empress Eudoxia now standing as the only real political leader of consequence, Stilicho was about ready to start re-pushing his claim to regency over Arcadius. But he was sidetracked by a barbarian invasion, and then really sidetracked when Alaric and his Goths invaded Italy. As we've already seen, the Hunnic migration into the Danube region led to massive population shifts among the existing barbarian populations. This process got started, of course, when Fritigern and his Goths came knocking back in the 370s, but that was just the opening round. In 401, a combined force of Vandals and Alans, fleeing from Olden's aforementioned attempts to subjugate them, reached the borders of the Roman Empire in the provinces of Raetia and Noricum, and, deciding that they stood a much better chance fighting Romans than fighting Huns, just kept right on moving west. Stilicho marched up from Italy at once, and through his usual brand of deft maneuvering was able to turn this horde back, but his deployment of the Italian army north of the Alps meant that the home province was now wide open to any threat that might happen along. Cue Alaric. As soon as Stilicho advanced out of Italy, Alaric saw a golden opportunity to gain some much-needed political and military security. His elevation to an official position within the Roman army had never been popular, nor were the subsidies that fed his people, who were now settled in Illyria. When his patron Eutropius was toppled, Alaric knew that his position was now shaky at best. When the people of Constantinople successfully drove Gainas and his Goths out of the capital, Alaric could see the writing on the wall. Pretty soon the supplies would stop coming in, he would be stripped of his command, and then very possibly toppled from power by his own angry countrymen. So in late 401, Alaric decided to go on the offensive, move west, and try his luck at extracting concessions from Milan. It was a risky bet because by crossing the Alps, Alaric was breaking his contract with Constantinople, so this was an all-or-nothing sort of play. He was preemptively burning his political bridges to the east. But while a risky bet, it was not necessarily a bad bet. With the bulk of the Western army engaged along the Upper Rhine, Alaric was able to enter Italy completely unchallenged, and then pretty much do whatever he wanted. The Gothic king initially got bogged down besieging the key fortress city of Aquileia, but he quickly and wisely gave that up, and decided to turn his attention to lower-hanging fruit. For the rest of the winter, the Goths ran amok throughout northern Italy, while the Roman authorities could only look on helplessly. Honorius and his houseguard at Milan could do nothing about Alaric, and Stilicho, his campaign against the Vandals et al. Pretty much wrapped up, was trapped on the wrong side of the snowed-in Alpine passes.